It's December 25th, 2022. My name is Ferguson. I'll be interviewing John Sorey. Also present in the room are my brother Jack Ferguson, my dad Jason Ferguson, and my other grandfather Barry Ferguson. And this is for the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project for Vietnam. So start with biographical details. Where were you born?
Nashville, Tennessee.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My father worked for the Veterans Administration. My mother was a housewife.
All right. Who are your siblings, names and genders?
Okay.
And if any, who served in the military?
I have two brothers, Don Sorey and Bill Sorey. Bill Sorey is deceased, but they both served in the military. Don served as a Marine in Vietnam, and Bill served in transportation in what's now known as Ethiopia.
All right. How did your family feel about you joining the service when you joined?
Well, my father was in World War II, so I think it was an expectation that you need to serve your country and be in the military. In addition, I had to pay my own way through school, so part of my motivation, in addition to being my patriotic duty, was the money that I earned being an ROTC officer.
And do you want to talk a little more about ROTC and how that worked with school?
Well, ROTC, I thought it was good discipline and it prepared you for the military. And I was the S1 adjutant in the ROTC brigade that we had at Tennessee Technological University.
The last biological one is what primary or what secondary schools and colleges did you attend?
The Donaldson High School and Tennessee Technological University in Coker, Tennessee.
Okay. So next, just wants us to get into early days of service. So after school, where did you go originally when you went to the military?
Okay, well, after school, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, went through the officer's basic course and airborne school.
And when was, what year was that?
That was 1965.
Okay.
August of 1965. And then I was assigned at that time to the 1st Infantry Division, which was already in Vietnam, and I think I'm going to Vietnam as an infantry platoon leader, which was not a great job to have at that time. But when I got to Fort Riley, Kansas, I learned that we were going to activate the 9th Infantry Division and take these young men from basic training all the way to Vietnam, which was a rather unique situation. But the worst job I've ever had, when I got to Fort Riley, Kansas, I was a junior second lieutenant on post, and so the job I received was survival assistance officer. So I had to go tell parents and wives that their husband or son had been killed in Vietnam and work with them for their benefits and attend the funeral, present the flag, those sort of things. I had the state of Kansas for 3 months. I had, as I recall, 56 families. Some I inherited, some I had to tell the bad news of what happened to their husband or son. And then fortunately we activated the 9th Infantry Division, and I was no longer the junior second lieutenant, and I was able to give that job to somebody else.
You're going to try to see what else.
We might want to talk a little bit about the activation of the 9th Infantry Division.
Yeah, that's
because that was, I said, a rather unique situation. And when we activated, even though I was still a second lieutenant, I was the senior second lieutenant. So initially on activation, I was the battalion commander, and then we got a lieutenant colonel in, and then we never had enough officers, so sometimes I would be a platoon leader, and then I made first lieutenant, so then I was either XO or company commander, depending upon whether we had a captain to be company commander or not.
And that was in Vietnam or just in?
No, that was
just in
the training.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things, I had A Company, 3rd Battalion, 47th Infantry, and one of the things I tried to do was make our company exceptional, and so we always, when we did PT, no matter how many push-ups the other companies did, we'd always do one more for them at the conclusion. And when we ran every day, however long the other companies ran, we would run past them before we turned around to come back. So, and it paid off. We had the lowest casualty / kill rate in Vietnam, which
Wow.
I think the spree, and then we won the rifle marksmanship of the battalion, and then we won the PT physical training for the battalion. So you build up the esprit, and one of the things, we had a lot of kids that didn't want to go to Vietnam, and I didn't want to take them to Vietnam, so ended up court-martialing a number of the recruits, and they didn't want to go, and I didn't want to take them, so it worked out pretty good.
How did that process work?
Well, typically they would go AWOL, or they'd be drunk, so they gave you an excuse to kick them out of the military. Of course, I'm not sure they realized the black mark it was going to put on their record, because being dishonorably discharged is not a good credential to get a job or do anything in your life.
Mm-hmm. So how long did that whole process, from when you got to Fort Riley to when you actually went to Vietnam, how long did that take?
I got to Fort Riley at the end of the year, and
In 65?
In 65, and it took us pretty much all of 67 to get the troops in and go through basic training, advanced individual training, small unit training, large unit training, and then we packed up and went to Vietnam at the end of 66.
Okay.
And got to Vietnam in early 67.
One of the questions on here, and this is also for me because I forget exactly the timeline, but is who you left behind. So when was John born?
The day I got back
From
Vietnam.
Okay, that's right.
So after we packed up, we came back to Nashville and left Dolores, and then went to Oakland, California, and got on a ship.
Okay.
And went to Vietnam, which was interesting because a number of my troops had never been on a ship, and we had guys, and they weren't faking it. I mean, they were really sick. They were sick before we got out of Oakland Harbor. And one thing that I'll never forget, when I'd go down to the enlisted mess to check on the troops, the odor of the preservatives in the food and that sort of thing. I had guys that they'd walk into the mess room and they'd immediately be outside on the rail. And some of them we had to put in sick bay and have IVs. I mean, they were sick the whole 2 weeks it took to get there.
That's a long time on
Yeah.
Last thing about training, do you have any other vivid memories about your time either in ROTC or during the training program, more when you were actually going through training than when you were leading?
When I was going through training? No, not particularly. I guess the key thing that in airborne school that you wanted to do, even whether you were an officer or an enlisted man, it didn't make any difference. You want to make as few mistakes as possible because every movement in airborne school was at double time, and anytime you made a mistake, you had to do push-ups. So you did 200 or 300 push-ups a day. Besides the first part of the day, the first thing you did in the morning, we ran 5-6 minute miles, and then you did the daily dozen, and then you start the day of training. So you pretty much ran all day, every day, kind of a situation. And you wanted to be sure you got your 5 correct exits from the 34-foot tower, because what happened, these parachutes, you'd hook to a cable and you'd exit the door in the proper form, and pretty soon these parachute harnesses had been used so much it was like instead of being 2 inches wide like it's supposed to be, it's almost like your little finger. So it would rub you raw pretty quickly. So you wanted to get your 5 qualified 34-foot tower exits as quick as possible.
So you never do that anymore.
If you didn't make it in the first couple of days, it was really hard on you. Fortunately, I made it in the first 2 days. So.
There you go. Did you have any instructors that you remember? If so, what were they like?
No,
Not
just
really.
all the airborne instructors were, in great physical shape and mean as could be. So they could run backwards for 5 miles. And what would happen? Not only you had to run 6-minute miles, but really less than that, because invariably you'd get dropped out to do 10 push-ups, and the drill sergeants were very respectful of officers. They'd say, "Give me 10, sir." That was the only difference between an enlisted man.
No, that's about all about training. So you got on the boat in Oakland, and it took 2 weeks to get to Vietnam. Where did you start in Vietnam?
Yeah, we came into Bearcat, and of course we thought we were ready for combat, but the thing I remember coming in, we were in deuce and a half, and on the horizon you see these jet fighters dropping bombs and that sort of thing. You realize, hey, this is for real. So we went to Bearcat and stayed there a couple of weeks getting used to the heat and humidity. And one of the things I'll never forget, we went down in a quote secure zone, but as we saw with Tet, there were no secure zones in Vietnam. But anyway, went down to this area and ran this operation with a Vietnamese popular force, and they had a fort there, and so we out slopping around, and we were down the Mekong Delta, so it was wet all the time. So we did some patrolling and then came back, and so the officers from the Vietnamese unit said that we could camp out here, and it was a nice flat area, no vegetation, kind of a mud flat, which we should have been smart enough to figure out, but they thought it was great. This was a standard orientation indoctrination process. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard one of my guys go plop and cussing, and so and at that time we were carrying air mattresses and poncho liners and entrenching tools and all this junk that we soon got rid of. So I felt, and my air mattress was floating, so what they did with the new units, they put them out there on that mud flat, and then when the tide came in, you were in about a foot of water, so they thought that was great fun. So that was our first operation.
So it talks about any other humorous or unusual events. We can do that now if you want. Or
Well,
I've heard
we should probably go on and talk about getting in country.
Sure,
so
yeah.
we went down to an operation area that was at the corner of the Mekong River and the Canal Commercial. The Army, on a contract basis, was growing this base, and they had a 36-inch dredge out in the Mekong River, dredging 24/7 days a week, building this base. And when we were at Dongtown, it was about 10 acres when we first got there, and of course we were long gone. But before the military left, I understand it was like 500 acres. So it was just constant pumping this sand in here and grading it down with a bulldozer and that sort of thing. Of course, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they love to try to mortar the dredge. So they shoot it. The dredge moved, every hour because they try to get a mortar zeroed in it. When I was there, they never hit it. So they hit all around it, but they never hit it. There was an island right across from Dongtown, and they'd come in there and they'd bury their mortar tubes in the mud, and they'd have them pretty well sighted in, and then they'd just drop 3 or 4 mortar tubes, and then they'd get out of there because as soon as they started firing the mortars, we dropped 105 shells on them. So, but they were gone. You never hit any. We go over there and look. We never found the body or any blood or anything, because they dropped 5 or 6 rounds and then they were gone. And you could walk right by a mortar tube, you'd never see it, because it only stick, basically flat with the ground. And so we were at Dongtam, and then we were known as the Riverine Group. We would insert in platoon-sized landing crafts up and down the Mekong River by water, or we would insert by air, do search and destroy. And the problem in the Mekong Delta was that it was so wet, you can only stay out really 3 days and 2 nights. So we'd insert at daylight by air or water, and then we would do search and destroy during the day, and then ambush patrols at night, and then next day, next night, and then search and destroy the 3rd day, and then come back in. So after about 3 months, we went aboard Navy ships. Unfortunately, the Company A was on this ship with the captain, which is equivalent to a colonel, the Navy captain that was head of this little fleet, and the battalion commander. We were on his ship. So what we would do at Dongtam, we had a barge, and we'd come in with the landing craft, and we'd take the mud down there in these rice paddies is like a gray clay. It stick to you like glue. So we'd take a fire hose and hose one another down. And one of the things that I insisted that our mess sergeant, which is another story I might not touch on, but our mess sergeant would have a hot meal when we came in. So when we put our stuff on the ships, and then we did our search and destroy. So we came in, and same barge next to this ship, worked one another off, and we came to the officers' mess. And first time we had seen china and napkins and a tablecloth in about 4 months. And so the Navy captain was a real hard guy, and so we had dinner that night, and I had a Lieutenant Kirk who was a West Pointer, but still rough, airborne ranger guy, but rough around the edges. And the cook had taken, and it was family style, had a big bowl of mashed potatoes, and the cook had taken a carrot and made it like a palm tree. Well, Kirk gets palm tree and all, and when he comes to his serving. And so about 9 o'clock, the battalion commander called me up, and I was company commander at that time. He called me up and said that the Navy captain had decided that before we came to dinner that we would shower and shave, because we hadn't shaved in 3 days and we were stinky and wet and one thing and another. So he said, before your officers come to dinner, they'll shower and shave, and tell Lieutenant Kirk if he ever gets the palm tree again, he'll be eating in the enlisted mess. But the problem with this guy was, if we got in late, we didn't eat. I mean, he was just trying to be a hard guy on us and that sort of thing. So there were some times when we got in after the officer's mess had concluded, before we could have time to shower and shave and put on clean fatigues, dinner was over. So we did without dinner. But that was kind of an interesting thing. Mm-hmm. So we were up and down the Mekong River on this Navy ship, and same thing. The NVA tried to mortar the ship, so the ship was constantly moving on a zigzag course. And fortunately, we never got hit. My biggest worry always when we dropped the landing craft gate, that there'd be a 50 caliber sitting up there. Mm-hmm. But what we would do, we would have usually 4 or 5 landing zones that we would prep with artillery and airstrikes. And so they didn't know which one that we were going to go into, but that was always the fear, because those 50 caliber were ricocheting around, and that landing craft would not have been a good situation. So we were up and down the Mekong River doing search and destroy and ambush patrols.
How long did you do that?
Well, fortunately, my 2 years ROTC ended up in August of '67, so I was only in Vietnam for 7 months.
Okay. So you had a little bit of time at the base, and then you went up and down the river.
Yeah,
after
so
that.
we were about 4 months at Dogtown, and the rest of the time we were afloat on the Navy ships.
What else do I want to ask off here? What kind of friendships or camaraderie did you form while serving, and with whom?
Well, as a commanding officer, you don't get too close to even your officers.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I should probably back up and talk about a bit. One of the most disheartening things that happened the first night that we had an ambush patrol. I had a sergeant only who had been in Korea. He was really a good platoon sergeant, and he and I were at the command post. I was not the company commander, but he pulled duty on the command post, different hours. So it was almost daylight, and one of the things you check with each position to get what you call a sit rep, situation report. And then we had this one post that didn't respond, so we thought they were probably asleep, and I made the mistake of, Sergeant Only was a tough actor, and so he was going to go out there and show those guys what it meant to be in a combat zone. As I said, he was a combat infantry sergeant from Korea, and so he went out there, and they weren't asleep. Their radio was not working properly. Of course, they were scared to death. We'd just gotten in country, and they shot him. Mm. And so I always regretted letting him go do that, because I felt like I should have not let him do it because we were in a safe zone. But he was pretty macho, and unfortunately they thought he was the bad guy, and they shot him. So that was our first casualty.
That's hard. I'm trying to think what else. How much of, like, when you did the ambush control and stuff like that, how much of it was actual combat and how much was it just...
Well, that was one of the awful things, the fact that in combat it's either absolute terror or nothing. Mm-hmm. And so most of the time nothing would happen, and that was, I didn't sleep much in Vietnam, because the platoon that I was with each night, and I would rotate between the three platoons, so I'd be with a different platoon every night, and I'd spend the whole night going from location to location trying to keep them awake, because as soon as they got in position they went to sleep. And so we'd have something happen, the BC would come in and machete a platoon, and that'd get everybody alert and that sort of thing. But keeping the guys awake, because like I say, 90% of the time nothing happened. Same thing on search and destroy. 90% of the time nothing happened, but then you'd get ambushed, and it was absolutely a crisis moment. So one of the good things that we did that really helped when we did engage the enemy, our brigade commander would not operate outside of 105 range. And 105s are great weapons. I mean, I could put a 105 round in your back pocket. So we always, the initial couple minutes of an ambush was really hectic, but once we got know where they were and got the artillery on them, it was pretty much over. So, the worst thing about Vietnam, we won every battle and lost the war, but it was a political war, and we had politicians decide how to fight the war. And the only way to win the war was to go to North Vietnam, which we could have easily done. They were afraid that China would get involved, so that's the reason we did do that. But there's some, one of the things I've done, and I didn't know much about Vietnam when I went, but one of the things I've done since then, read a lot. And when you read about the history of Vietnam, I mean, they had been overrun by China multiple times, the French, and so they were really an independent nation. If our leaders had read a few of those books, we were known not to have gone to Vietnam because there wasn't much way to win that war without taking North Vietnam out, and they didn't have the courage to do that. So it was a situation where the local Vietnamese, if the NVA were in control, then they were for the NVA. If we were in control, they were for us. And also you had the infighting of the leaders of the country, everybody trying to make money on the deal and be the leader. So there never was a real good leader of Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese did a better job of getting the people engaged and committed to them than we did. Because every Vietnamese officer was taking graft and doing things to benefit themselves all the way up through the president of the country. So it was not a good situation. It was another one of those political deals that we should probably never have gotten into.
Were there any things, or how do you think that your wartime experience changed you?
Well, I think it probably made me, Dolores, my wife, think that hardened me, that made me more callous, less emotional. But probably the best thing it did for me was made me a decision maker. One of the things in combat, no decision is the worst decision. So one of the things I have a reputation for in business, in management after that, was making decisions. You know, sometimes I made a decision too quickly, but in combat, you make a decision, and if you need to modify it, you keep alternatives available to modify it. So I was definitely a decision maker in my business career.
I'm trying to think of this. I think it's interesting here. Was there anything you did for good luck?
No, just trying not to do anything real stupid. But as far as having a rabbit's foot or anything of that sort, you know, I just tried to. One of the things I would do before we ran the mission, I'd go out in a light observation helicopter, the little bubble kind of helicopters, and we'd look at the area and that sort of thing. So I tried to do a good job of reconnaissance, trying to do a good job of keeping my guys spread out. They always want to bunch up, and you get bunched up, you get ambushed, you get several people killed real quick. So, and trying to be sure that we knew where we were. The difference now, the technology at that point in time, we basically had a map, which was not very good, a compass, and 105 spotted rounds. So we'd have 105 rounds that would be fired at certain coordinates to try to keep up where you were. But the technology that the infantry soldier has today, I mean, he knows exactly where he is, but we always had issues about airstrikes or artillery strikes. We had several times where we got both on friendly positions, so friendly fire was always an issue.
Are there any other specific stories? I feel like you should probably talk about your Purple Heart at some point. But any other stories from?
No, not any big deal.
Bronze Star?
From that stat. But you know, the Purple Heart, Charlie figured out that we didn't like the leeches in the rice fields, so they had these canals they would use to irrigate the rice field, and so you had to, when you got in those, they were full of leeches. So we didn't like those, so they learned we would prefer to jump across the dike or the canal instead of wading through it. So they would dig holes on each side of the canal because they didn't know which side you're going to jump across, and they split this bamboo, and then they'd harden it in fire, and they put these punji sticks. So I jumped across the canal and stuck a punji stick in my leg. So not much of a purpose. Several our guys did. We had several guys killed and that sort of thing, but it was something that I was fortunate that didn't happen. So.
And then the Bronze Star too.
Well, the Bronze Star and the battalion commander would own me about the fact that I didn't need to be a point guy on patrols, but the Bronze Star with the V for Valor was a little firefight that we had, which wasn't a big deal. And then I got a Bronze Star for meritorious service, and then an Army Commendation Medal for meritorious service, and one with a V device for valor. So not a big deal. The big deal was my guys that we got killed in Vietnam. That was a big deal.
So how big was your company?
Well, it's supposed to be about 150, and it typically was about 100. Okay. We never, once we got to Vietnam, we never were at full strength.
Do you know how many you lost? I don't know if that's a bad question, but
not exactly. I'd say probably 30. But one of the things that the NVA and Viet Cong were interested in doing, they'd kill you if they had a chance, but they were more delighted with wounding you, send you back to the States, because Ho Chi Minh and his leaders, they were very good understanding propaganda and that sort of thing. So if they could send a wounded soldier home, that had more negative propaganda value in America, and all the anti-war stuff and that sort of thing. Most of the anti-war stuff, those people were just cowards. They didn't want to go to Vietnam because they didn't want to be a soldier. But most of my guys were glad to be there. Maybe glad's not the right word. They were there because they felt like it was their duty, and they were good soldiers. I had a lot of guys from rural areas which were good soldiers, and some of the city guys were good soldiers, but most of the city guys were not really very good soldiers.
Do you remember the day that your service ended and where you were?
Well, what you did when you got within 2 or 3 days of being out of the country, you would come back to base camp and get processed, and then I flew from Saigon to Oakland and processed out, and then flew to Chicago, and I called Dolores in Chicago, and she was pregnant with John, and so I flew to Nashville, and then John was born the next day.
Wow. That was good.
That was pretty good homecoming. But one quick story that you'll get a chuckle out of. So I'd been up for, I guess, 3 days at that time, and still in my khakis. And so John was born. So the next morning, Baptist Hospital in Nashville has about a 12-foot wide sidewalk with shrubs on each side. And so about 8 o'clock in the morning, I was going to go change clothes, shave, and clean up. And so I walk outside of Baptist Hospital, and a car backfires, and I jump into the shrubbery. And of course, Vietnam soldiers didn't have a very high esteem at that time, so everybody's looking at me like, what kind of idiot are you? So I thought it was incoming.
How did you feel about homecoming in general with the sentiment with the war? And
I didn't really have, I pretty quickly became a civilian, so I didn't have much issue or contact with the anti-war environment. Went to work for Latin Industries there in Nashville, and they were very supportive. General Westmoreland was on our board, so I'd say the majority of the Latin people, which you're basically your community, is your work, your church, that sort of thing. So most of the people were supportive, but you didn't make a big deal out of being a Vietnam veteran at that time. It's much more honorable to be a Vietnam veteran today than it was in 1967.
How did you readjust to civilian life in general?
I didn't have any problems with it. I'm convinced that in looking at my troops, the ones I had problems with in the U.S. in training and in Vietnam in combat, they're the ones that had problems here. So that goes back to being pretty hard-nosed. I think most of the, all this combat fatigue that people talk about, that sort of thing, I think they had issues before they went to Vietnam.
And then you talked about work a little bit, but you also went back to school, didn't you?
Yeah, well, but that was maybe
Later.
a couple of years afterwards when I got an MBA at night.
Did you join any veteran organizations?
No.
Or any reunions or anything?
Well, the only thing I had to do, I had to be in the reserves for 2 years.
Okay.
And go to summer camp, which I never thought the Army had very good planning or did things that made much sense. So as an example, my first year of the reserves, go to summer camp, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, so where should they send me? They should have sent me to Fort Campbell, Kentucky or Fort Knox. Well, where did they send me? Fort Lewis, Washington, about as far away as I could be. So I get there and I'm assigned to headquarters and headquarters company and band, and the major, this was the New Jersey National Guard Division, which I didn't have much use for. So, but the training officer sent me some manuals and asked me to prepare some lesson plan, and at that time they were using National Guard for riot control and that sort of thing. So I was supposed to teach these riot control classes. So I had my lesson plan done, but first I got there on Sunday. Monday morning, first morning that I was going to be with this New Jersey National Guard Division, I thought I was back in the military, so I get dressed and go up for reveille to see what kind of outfit these guys were. Well, I wasn't real happy that they were headquarters company and band, so they were falling out, half dressed, needing haircuts and that sort of thing. So I was dropping people, making them do push-ups and that sort of thing. So the G3 called me in about 9 o'clock and said, you're really not back in the military. You don't need to make reveille. So I had a great 2 weeks. I taught my classes, and the other time I'd go down to motor pool and get a car and go to Mount Rainier or whatever. So I got to see a lot of that part of Washington, but it wasn't much of a military outfit.
To clarify for the record, Mount Rainier is Mount Rainier. He struggles with that one. Did you keep in touch with anybody from your company when you got back? Or?
No, really didn't.
There's not a lot left on here. How has your military service impacted your general feelings about war or the military in general?
Well, I think you need to be sure that, and another perfect example is Afghanistan and Iraq. You don't need to get into a war unless you or a military operation, of whether it's Korea police action as they call it. That's still they were all still wars. Afghanistan, Iraq. You need to have a mission, and we need to realize, after seeing what happened in Vietnam and reading their history, is the fact that we can't make these people who have in Iraq, they're basically tribal, and they've been fighting one another for years, and they don't understand. And we've had a great experience in the U.S. of a melting pot and people coming together with common goals and aspirations and that sort of thing. But that doesn't happen in most of these foreign countries. So I don't think we should get into a military action unless we have a clear strategy that it has major impact on the U.S. and that we're in to win. And the way you win is on offense. You don't win being on defense like we were in Vietnam.
Do you have any other messages you'd like to leave for future generations who might listen to this interview?
Well, I think it's a great honor to serve in the military. I think we made a major mistake when we eliminated the draft, because a lot of the young people today need some discipline, need some physical training. And one of the things that happens in basic training, you get guys that come in, some are skinny, some are fat. At the end of the basic 6 weeks of basic training, they all look about the same. They're all about 140, 50 pounds, and they're in good physical condition, and they're good discipline and that sort of thing. So I think that we made a major mistake eliminating that requirement for our young people. They need that discipline. So I think the draft elimination was a bad decision.
Just a couple things to wrap it up. Is there anything you would like to add that we haven't covered?
No, I think.
Or any stories or anything that you haven't shared that you'd like to share?
No, I think you don't talk much about it. I think that this is more than I've talked about it since I came back from
That's more than
Vietnam.
I've ever heard you talk about it.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you wish people knew more about veterans?
Well, I think they should respect and be proud of veterans, and I would encourage young people to join the military and be a veteran.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.